Welcome to this video on Micro Focus Filr best practices. My name's Robin Redgrave. I'm a solutions consultant based out of the UK. So first of all, maybe what we should ask is, what is Filr? Filr solves a couple of problems that you have. First of all, how do your users securely access files that are sitting on internal storage when they're remote? And indeed, how do they do it from different clients? They may be running on Windows, Mac, they may want to do it from their mobile phone and so on. And the second thing is that users also need to have a secure way that they can share files that are sitting on internal storage with colleagues internally and also external users. The thing is, if you don't provide this to your users, they're going to bypass IT and start using unauthorized cloud sharing solutions where you have no control. They'll upload files there, users can access them, you have no idea who's been accessing those files, and indeed think of what happens when that user leaves the organization. They've still got those files sitting in their personal storage area that you've got no control over. So Filr is an appliance or appliances that you can deploy in front of your existing storage, and your users can access that from Windows, Mac, iOS devices, Android devices, browser, and so on. And that can expose existing storage that you've got in OES servers, maybe Windows, network attached storage, and your users can authenticate, or certainly your internal users can authenticate against an LDAP directory, eDirectory, or Active Directory typically. We can also have users within the Filr environment itself that don't actually exist in your directory should you wish. And the great thing about this is that we reuse your existing storage. You're not going to have to move terabytes from your existing storage to a cloud-based solution, for instance. And because we're using that existing storage, all your existing permissions and access controls that you've got set up on those files are still active within the Filr solution. And also your quotas, if you've got quotas set for your users. The files stay on-prem and you are in charge of the security and privacy of those files. Users can share files based on what network folder you're exposing and what rights they have, both internally and externally. And of course, the IT department stays in control of this information. You're not passing control of your documents on to someone else. So some of the advantages that you've got of Filr, things like rapid deployment. Typically, you can deploy in hours and not days to get this set up within your environment. There's no need to migrate data, as we said. We just access the files where they are on your existing storage. We also have things like online collaborative editing of documents. So there's some DLP options around that, but I can have multiple users editing the same file at the same time. And of course, everything gets audited. So I know when somebody's shared a file, when somebody's deleted a file, when somebody's viewed a file, when someone's deleted a share. All of that information is logged. Let's just go into some of the best practices now. First of all, check what rights users have to the file system at the moment. Often I have people contact me saying, this user can see the finance directory or whatever, they shouldn't have rights to that, why are you exposing it? And in fact, if you look, they do have rights to the finance directory because maybe 5 years ago they worked there as a temp while someone was away on holiday and no one removed those rights. So just be aware that we do expose what people have rights to. So maybe check that people have the rights that they should have in your system. Check files in the right location. You don't want to have a file that has credit card information in, for instance, in a folder that people can share externally. You only want that to be able to be shared internally, or not at all maybe. We've got products like File Reporter that will report on this sort of information, tell you who's got the access control, what types you've got, what content you've got. Before you implement Filr, check that the information that you're exposing is actually what you want to expose. Next, make sure that you configure online updates in the Filer environment. Looking at the telemetry that we get back that's sent anonymously from Filer systems, for those of you that have enabled telemetry, we can see that a lot of organizations are not patching their Filer systems in a timely manner. Often we release patches not only with additional features but also for security purposes, and it's better that those get applied sooner rather than later. If need be, we can do offline patching if you're in an air-gapped environment, so you can do offline or SMT based patching. As far as communications are concerned, make sure that everything is over a secure connection. Use a valid certificate, and we ship by default with a self-minted certificate, but many Apple devices won't accept a self-minted certificate. It has to be a valid certificate for that to work, and obviously it's a bit nicer for your users if they don't get a warning that the certificate isn't trusted when they access the system. So do use a valid certificate. As far as authentication is concerned, if you're using LDAP against Active Directory or eDirectory, that would be far better to be done over LDAP-S than LDAP. Generally, it's considered bad form to pass passwords in plain text over the wire, so LDAP-S would be the way to go there. And as far as database access is concerned, again, you've got the option there to encrypt communication to the database. And of course, as far as SMTP is concerned, that can also be secured. But just bear in mind that obviously that's to the next relay point. Let's just have a look at some of those options. So as far as certificates are concerned, those can be imported in the certificate store here. As far as the web-based certificate, you just import it here. You can see I've imported one here. If you're doing LDAP-S, then you need to import the trusted root for your LDAP server into the JVM certificates rather than the web certificates. And let's just have a look at the database encryption option that you've got as well. So here I've got this option to encrypt database communication. In this case, I'm just running on a single server, so it's not really needed, but in a large clustered environment, you most probably would want to do that. Do consider doing a clustered install. By far the most installations out there are single server installs, mainly because they're easy to implement. It takes 1 hour to set up and get going. You may want to have a clustered install if you're looking at growing in the future and having more users accessing the system. Improved performance because we're splitting processes off onto different servers, and indeed high availability. So if there's a problem with something, you're not going to stop the whole system. So for instance, if you have to do a full reindex on a single server, I've got to take the system down while I do that. On a clustered install, I can reindex one server while the other index server is still working, and then switch over and reindex the other server. Also consider having a dedicated node for file synchronization and indeed administration. And on that one, you may want to increase the number of threads that are used for synchronization. And obviously, if you've got a dedicated synchronization node, disable it on the nodes that your users are connecting to. You can also split off some traffic if you want to other nodes so that you're not putting everything on 1 or 2 nodes, and you can split off specific clients, for instance, such as desktop or mobile, to specific web nodes. And also consider load balancing the content editor. If you are going to do that, it's not quite as simple as just doing a round robin between content editor nodes. You do need to route everything based on the WOPI source parameter, because everyone editing the same document needs to go to the same node. Otherwise, you're going to find people are going to start overwriting each other's work. Let's just show you where you can set that synchronization option. On the net folders option in the VA administration console, I've got the option here to allow synchronization. So on the web nodes that I'm letting users go to, I turn that off, so that way their connections are not going to be impacted if there's a synchronization going on. And then on the dedicated administration synchronization node, I will enable that. And most probably, because there are no users on this node, I'll increase the maximum number of simultaneous synchronizations and indeed the threads that are used per sync. So let's just look at one possible deployment of a large cluster. I've got some web nodes. You can see I've got a dedicated admin node here, a couple of content editors, 2 search appliances. Typically, we would recommend a maximum of 2 search appliances. I know that we do have some customers running 3. We can see that coming through on the telemetry, but normally we'd recommend 2. And then the database. Just be aware on the database that our database appliance cannot be clustered. So in a large clustered environment, I prefer using an existing database that may be in place there, and that way you're making use of existing backup procedures and high availability on that. Otherwise, you can build your own database cluster should you wish, and obviously we support Postgres, MySQL, MS SQL, and obviously Maria. If you are deploying a cluster, you don't need to deploy all these servers. You could just get by with 1 web node, 1 search, 1 content editor, and 1 database appliance there. So you don't need to initially deploy such a big environment, and then you can just add servers to that should you need to. As far as proxy users are concerned, we have a couple of proxy users that we need in the Filr environment. One is for LDAP and to access user and indeed group information. And the other is to access the file system, which is used for the file synchronization, admin user, and indeed for external users and some internal users. If I share a file with a colleague and they don't have rights to that directory, then it will be this user that accesses that share on their behalf. Something to bear in mind, I see this so often when looking at customers' environments, is that they're using the admin or administrator user. Please don't, it's bad form. Usually I just create a user, I'll call them Filr proxy, and then on that user I just limit the file rights and directory rights to what is needed. Something to bear in mind is that if you are using home directories as my files, then you need to make sure that that user does have rights to that attribute. Some other settings, and this one is actually in Filr Advanced only, is that you can limit what file types are allowed to be uploaded into the system. So you've got an option for a whitelist or blacklist. I tend to use a whitelist. The reason for that is that we use a technology called Apache Tika that checks the signature of the file. So that can help prevent ransomware being uploaded into your system and indeed overwriting existing files that may exist there. Also consider setting a maximum upload size on the upload settings so that users can't just keep on uploading massive files and take up all your space. Let's just have a look at that. So here, if I just go into the administration console to file upload, you can see here I can set an upload size limit, maximum size limit, and in the file type blocking I can set a whitelist, and here I've got that preset to the standard sort of file types that you may have. So let's just show you the ransomware protection that we've got here. I just close that down and come into a directory. So let's just go into this directory, and I'm going to upload a couple of files. So let's take this file called bad file and this file called good file, and I'll drag and drop those in. And you'll see there that the good file has been uploaded, but the bad file, even though it's a docx file, has been blocked. The reason for that is that it isn't actually a Word document, it's a ransomware encrypted file there. So I can't upload that file, and indeed if I had a good copy of that file, I'm not going to overwrite it with a bad copy. So a little bit of protection there that you've got against ransomware. As far as sharing rights are concerned, keep the sharing rights to only those that need it. You don't want to let everyone share externally if there's going to be a security problem with that. So you can limit who has that. And I tend to use LDAP groups for setting up these rights. That way you can use a distributed administration system within your existing directory, be it Active Directory or eDirectory, for setting up those sharing rights. Let me just show you what I mean by that. So in the administration console, if I just look at the share and comment settings, you can see that I've got 3 groups here for global sharing with a link, global share internal, and indeed external. So these are LDAP groups that I'm pulling through from the directory and setting up the global rights. And then for each net folder that we've got, let's just take this one for instance, you'll see that I'm giving all internal users access to this folder. You may think, why do I want to give all internal access to maybe the finance folder? Well, what we're doing there is we're saying we're just passing it off to the file system to work out whether they can actually see it or not. So if I don't have rights to this particular net folder, I'm not going to see it. Often I see people trying to replicate the file rights that they've got in here when they don't need to. You can just say everyone can see it and leave it to the file system to work out. And if I don't have rights to it, I won't see it. But as far as the sharing rights are concerned, you can see here I have share rights for internal, external, and link. Again, these are groups that are being pulled through from the directory. So I can use a distributed administration system for this with just people who have rights to those groups in the directory, updating those groups, and then that user getting the appropriate rights here. Do consider running reports. Now, there are a lot of reports that you've got in the system, and it does let you keep an eye on what's going on and what's happening. We have a lot of reports there, but most probably the full audit report is the one that people find most useful. We also do have SIEM integration. So if you do have an SIEM solution, we can pass information to that of all the events that are happening within the Filer environment. And you can, if you have some third-party monitoring solution that doesn't support CEF, you can monitor events by looking at the tables in the database. There are a number of tables you may want to look at: basic audit, login audit, sharing audit, and they've recently added a new table called CEF events, I think, that you could also monitor as well, which is an amalgamation of those 3. Let's just show you some of the reports. In the administration console, down here, I've got reports, and I've got a drop down here of a number of different reports that I can run. I'm just going to take the user activity report, and if I say report based on a workspace there, and I'll just generate that. Open that with my spreadsheet. Let's just expand that out so you can see this. So here you can see, obviously this is my test system, so there isn't that much information in here. You can see the view, downloaded, modifying items, adding items to and files to the system. You can see here added a share, modified a share, and so on. So every action that is happening gets logged in the system. So you have a full audit of what's going on. Bear in mind though that by default those events get deleted after 6 months, but you can change that. There's a setting. Let me just show you where that setting is on the database logs. You can change this option here to extend that if for regulatory purposes you need that to be 3 years, for instance. And something else just to mention here, that if there's a report that you want that isn't in there, then usually you can create an SQL query against the database that will do the report for you. Another reporting option that you have is Ganglia. This runs on the Filer appliances and allows you to monitor what's going on in the system. So you can access this through the 9443 administration interface, and at the end here you can see I've got Ganglia monitoring, and let's just do a search for some of the filer reports. So let's just take that, and here I've got them all coming up here. So you can see here deferred update log. I've got total file reads, total writes, and indeed I can drill down into this to get more detailed information across different time spans. So you've got some information there that may be quite useful. On the share and comment settings option, there are some settings for whitelist and blacklist. So you can specify users or indeed domains that you don't want people sharing with, or indeed that people are only allowed to share with. So you may specify that you're only allowed to share with sister companies in the same group as you. Also think about, you've got the option there for terms and conditions. So do consider putting in a disclaimer there. Most probably talk to your legal team about what the text should be. And when an external user is self-registering after somebody's shared a file with them, they have to accept those terms and conditions before being able to continue. Also think about enabling file requests. That's for Filer Advanced only. By default it's disabled, but certainly I find that quite useful, so that if somebody is trying to send me a large log file they can't email, I can just generate a file request, they click on the link and upload the file into our Filer environment. It makes transferring of files a little bit easier than it might otherwise be. As far as the client settings are concerned, consider setting the defaults to the most secure options and then use an override at the user or group level for the settings that you actually want to have. And of course you can use LDAP groups again for overriding that. So if I wanted to give a user access to Filer Mobile, I can just add them to the Filer Mobile group in the directory, and that group would have the right to use Filer Mobile. So again, users don't need to come into the administration console in Filer to change security settings. Let's just show you where you can set that. So the application settings are these three settings here. So I can set this to disable mobile access for everyone. And then on a user or group basis, I have this group here called Filer Mobile Users. And I can just set the options here to override the default settings and allow access. So you can see how we can control and have very fine granularity on what users can or can't do. On the desktop settings, I tend to use a whitelist rather than a blacklist. By default, it ships with a blacklist, but there's some issues I found with that, in that if you have an application that's doing a scan through the directory, maybe antivirus or indexing, and we don't have that on the blacklist, then that's going to go through and pull down files off the server to the desktop. So I tend to use a whitelist. That's a little bit more important when maybe a user's running an executable called ransomware.exe. We don't know what the file name is. It was only created a couple of days ago, so we haven't been able to add it to our list, and it's going to go through the whole system, pulling down files off the server and encrypting those files. So if you have a whitelist, only applications such as Word, Excel, PowerPoint are able to actually dynamically pull down files from the server. There shouldn't be a problem if users need to edit a file that's not in the whitelist. They can just offline the file and then edit it, or indeed get the administrator to add that application to the whitelist. Something else I find that many customers don't do is modify their emails that they're sending out. I feel that the emails that we send out by default are fairly plain, and you may want to start adding in things like your corporate logo, put your own text in there. You may want to even have a legal disclaimer at the bottom. So we do have this capability that you can edit the email template should you wish to. Something that's available with Filer Advanced only is Advanced Authentication. And indeed, with a Filer Advanced, you do get a license for Advanced Authentication Limited with your maintenance. So no additional cost. You can start using multi-factor authentication to get access to your environment. Typically, we see users using SMS one-time password, email one-time password, and maybe a time-based one-time password, which are the methods that you've got in the limited edition. If you want to have other methods of authentication, something like smartphone, smart card, facial recognition, maybe even geofencing, where you can specify where the user has to be in order to access the environment, then obviously you can buy the full product. Let me just show you that working. So here I've got my iPhone, so we can see my SMS one-time password coming in. And if I just log in here as a normal user using my normal credentials, you'll see there's one extra step we need to do, where it will prompt me for my one-time password. And there it is arriving, 156301. And click next, and I can authenticate. So you can see there the multi-factor authentication kicking in. And as I said, as far as the software for doing that is concerned, that's included with your Filer Advanced maintenance. In this case, I'm using a SMS service called Twilio, which obviously you need to subscribe to. Let's just talk about some of the configuration files. There's probably the main configuration file that we've got for Filer is a file called ssf-ext.properties, and that, I don't know, I haven't counted, but I would think has 1,000 odd settings in for different aspects of Filer. But if you're going to make any changes to that configuration file, then actually make them to a file called ssf-ext.properties. Thing is that the ssf-properties file is going to be overwritten from time to time during upgrades. So with that separate ext file, any changes you do are kept safe. There are some undocumented switches. Just be aware that support may tell you to put in from time to time. And if you are going to be making modifications to that file, just be aware that each node that you've got in your cluster needs to be modified, and indeed the Filer process needs to be restarted. So that's just a RC Filer restart on the console. Some settings that you can put in there, for instance, you can change how many recent files are being displayed for how many days. And indeed, if you set the activity to -1, that will hide the recent files option totally. If you want to extend the timeout, then you can put in some settings for that. By default, unlike the old web UI that you may be familiar in the past, which had, I think, a 4-hour timeout, the new UI defaults to 15 minutes. So you may want to think about extending that in the future. And if you're doing re-indexing, then something you can always do is increase the number of threads that you've got for re-indexing, and also defer, if you've got full content indexing enabled, defer that to be done afterwards, so you can index everything. Users can start getting into the system and using the system, and then the full content indexing will happen after that. If you have Filer Advanced, then I'd strongly recommend that you implement the content editor. It gives you quite a few DLP options. For instance, when people are editing a document, that document's still in the data center. The only bit that's at the workstation is the page that, or half page, that they're editing at that point in time. You can disable the option to edit with application. That's just one of the settings that you've got in the ssf-properties file that you can modify. You also have some DLP options there, things like don't allow printing, don't allow people to save as, don't copy data out of the document, add a watermark with the person's email address. And if there's some settings that you need to change, such as the timeouts, for instance, then you can edit the lol WSD XML file, which has those in. Do consider using email integration, and we've got integration for both GroupWise and Outlook, albeit the Outlook capabilities are part of Filer Advanced. And this effectively lets you strip out email attachments and just sends a link to the file that's in Filer. So rather than having to send large files around, or indeed if your mail system doesn't have a single message store, separate copies of that file, you're just going to send a link to that file in the Filer system and it's only stored there once. Depending how you're sharing that, you can share it without authentication, so the user can click on the link and access the file, or you can force them to go through a self-sign-up and authentication method, which obviously is a little bit better for IT because they've got the full status tracking on that and they know who's accessing the file because they've authenticated, whereas with the anonymous access, you have no idea who's accessed that file. And of course, if you've got anonymous access, then the user can forward that link to someone else who can access it and so on, whereas if it's authenticated access, only they can access that file. So some other options to consider are passwords. If your users are LDAP users, then consider setting the complexity for that. For your internal local users and your external users, you've got an option to set complexity rules for those users. So that would be something to consider there. And also, what are you going to set your admin and root passwords coming into the appliance? And as far as the admin user is concerned, something you may consider is changing the admin username from admin to Filer admin or something else. So just to give it a little bit of extra security there. As far as the files are concerned, encrypt what you can. The Filer cache directory on your workstation you can encrypt using the standard Windows folder encryption capabilities. The VA share, where your personal storage is, depending where that is sitting, maybe on a Windows server, you could use disk encryption on that particular disk to encrypt the data that's there. As for LDAP, consider, rather than importing everyone that's in your environment, just import a subset of the users. You can obviously set the base DN to a specific container to import only the users in that container and subcontainers. Now, what I tend to do myself is use an LDAP filter and then create a group in the directory and just specify that only members of that group are going to be imported. So if the user has access to Filer, I just add them to that group, and the next time that the sync runs, they'll be added to the Filer environment. And actually, just so you're aware, a user can authenticate before the sync, and if they match up to being in the filter, they will authenticate and it will create their account. As far as groups are concerned, import all the groups that you use for file access. If you don't have a group and imported, and we say that group has got access to this folder, we don't know who the users are for that folder. So the users aren't going to be able to see it. I have customers phoning me up saying, I can't see this folder, I should have access. And they haven't actually imported the group that has access to that, so that's why they can't see it. You can obviously, if you wanted to limit what groups were being imported, you can use a filter on that if need be, and we can import nested groups as well. That will work. You can do that with both eDirectory and, if you use this particular filter, with Active Directory. So something else you may want to do is disable the visibility of all your LDAP groups. It gets a bit confusing for the end user when they're sharing an item and all these groups with weird names appear. So you can stop those being visible to the end user. And then if you want to have specific groups that are in the directory visible, you can create a local group and set that up to be a dynamic group and sync that with the LDAP group. So for those particular groups, then they will be synced and be accessible by the end user when sharing items. Let me just show you where that's done. So in the share and comment settings, I've got an option here, which is checked by default. So allowing users to share with groups that have been imported from LDAP. So in this case, I've disabled that so they won't see them. And if I want to sync one or two particular groups with an LDAP group, I can come in here, and down here I can say the group membership is dynamic, and in here I just specify the base DN where the group is I want to come in, and specify an LDAP filter for that particular group. So that way, as the group changes in the directory, it will be updated here and still be visible for my users. Now, one last thing before we finish is talking about file synchronization. What this does is just update the database with file metadata. It's a process that runs on a regular basis. Just to clarify, files are not moved from your existing storage into the appliance or anything like that. They stay where they are, so you don't need double the storage or that sort of thing. Typically, you'd want to do a synchronization once a day, once a week, depending on how big that folder structure is. And one thing I would strongly recommend that you enable and implement is just-in-time synchronization. What this is as a user accesses a directory, JITs will kick in and do a quick look at that directory and show those results sort of at that real point in time. If you don't enable it and a user goes into a directory, they're going to see what that directory looked at last time the sync ran. So please enable just-in-time synchronization. Let's just have a look at where you can get some further information from. We do have a community server, and on there you can ask questions, you'll find tips from our engineers, you can put in ideas of feature enhancements you want with the ideas exchange, and you've got videos there that take you through configuration and options and so on. We do have a monthly product update webinar at this link here. And on these webinars, we typically have a look at future features that are going to be put in the product, which gives our development team an opportunity to get a bit of feedback from the community as to what those features should look like. And finally, we do have documentation available up on our documentation website, so I do recommend that you have a look at that. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you found it useful. Goodbye.